What's going on, guys? Welcome to Danny Wright's Dragon Stories. In a world where dragons and humans unite, kindness becomes strength, and friendship creates legend. So let's dive into the story.
The fence had a hole in it, not a big hole, just wide enough for a folded piece of paper to slip through if a 7-year-old pressed it flat and pushed carefully with 2 fingers. Nora Wade had noticed the gap 11 days ago. She had been noticing a lot of things lately that most of the adults at Station Redfield had stopped bothering to look at. The claw prints, for example. They started about 40 meters from the fence line, deep and wide, pressed into the dry red earth like something very heavy had been standing there for a long time. The adults called the area Forbidden Ridge and put up the fence, and then mostly forgot about what was on the other side of it. The Galactic Survey Council had posted a notice on the gate. It said, "Protected Zone, Inert, Non-Hostile Entity, No Approach." Most people read that and walked away. Nora read it and started drawing. She was not a particularly unusual child. She was small for her age, with short dark hair that her mother trimmed badly every few months, and she wore the same dusty boots every day because she could not be bothered to change them. She liked beetles, and she liked crayons, and she liked sitting very still and watching things that other people walked past. That was all. She was not brave in any dramatic sense. She just did not see the point in being afraid of something she had never actually met. The canyon beyond the ridge was dark even in daylight. The rock walls were a deep rust color, carved by old wind into shapes that looked almost like writing if you stared long enough. The colony had been on Drayan 7 for 3 years, and nobody had ever seen the creature directly. It was on the survey maps as Subject V1, Vreth Elder, last confirmed individual, Continental Zone 4. There were old photographs taken from a distance. Big, winged, dark-scaled, eyes that caught light from half a kilometer away. Nora thought it looked lonely in the photographs. She had drawn herself first. A careful picture in orange and brown crayon, her arms out to the sides, and a large wave coming from her right hand. She wrote her name underneath in block letters because she wanted to be clear. Then she folded it twice and walked to the fence alone during the dust watch, when the wind came up from the south and everyone else went inside. She found the gap and pushed the drawing through. Then she stood there for a moment, looking into the canyon below the ridge. The wind moved across the rocks. Nothing else moved. She could not see anything down there in the shadows. But the shadows were deep and wide, and something that lived inside them did not have to show itself to be present. She heard a breath. It was not loud. It was not close. It came from somewhere below and to the left, a long, slow exhale like the sound a very large fire makes when it is dying down. It lasted about 3 seconds and then stopped. The wind kept going. Nothing else happened. Nora stood there a little longer. Then she turned around and walked back to the settlement before her mother came looking. She did not sleep well that night. Not from fear, from thinking. She lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about what kind of sound that had been. It had not sounded angry. It had not sounded like a warning. It had sounded in the way that a child's instincts sometimes understood things more directly than any adult logic could, like something that had been very quiet for a very long time. She got up at first light and went back. She did not bring another drawing. She just wanted to stand at the fence and look. The canyon was pale in the early light, the rocks going from deep red to a dusty pink at the edges. The claw prints were still there in the dirt, exactly where she had seen them before. She crouched down and studied the fence line near the gap. The drawing was gone. She had pushed it through at ground level, and it had landed on the other side. She could see the faint marks in the dust where it had sat, the slight press of the paper against the earth. But the paper itself was not there. It had not blown away. The wind had not been strong enough overnight, and there was no sign of it caught against the fence wire or scattered in the dirt nearby. Something had picked it up. Nora stood and looked into the canyon for a long time. The shadows were still too thick to see anything clearly. She put her hand through the fence gap, not far, just her fingers, and she waved. Small and slow, the way she had drawn herself waving. Nothing moved in the canyon, but from somewhere deep in that darkness, quiet as a stone settling, came another long exhale. She pulled her hand back. Then she smiled, just to herself, and walked home to get more crayons. Behind her, somewhere below the forbidden ridge, in the cold dark of a canyon that had been silent for 300 years, something that had stopped expecting anything at all sat very still and held a folded piece of paper in claws that had learned, long ago, to be gentle with small things. Agati looked at the drawing for a long time. Then it did not put it down. 341 years was a long time to hold something without letting go. Dracker did not think in numbers the way the survey maps counted them. He thought in losses. The loss of Veth, his bonded partner, who had died in the last great sickness when the world still had other Vreth voices in it. The loss of the eastern nesting grounds, buried under a rockfall 2 centuries ago. The loss of sound itself, the slow, going quiet of a world that had once been full of a language no one alive spoke anymore. He had stopped moving much after the humans came. Not because he feared them, because there was no reason to move. The canyon gave him shelter. The deep rock held warmth at night. He ate when something came within reach, and he slept long stretches that blurred together until days and seasons felt like the same thing repeated at different angles of light. He had watched the colony go up from a distance. Small, pale creatures carrying things and building fast, the way insects built, always moving, always adding. They put up the fence without coming to ask him anything. A paper notice on a gate, and then they left him alone. He did not mind being left alone. He had been left alone for a very long time. But the drawing was different. He had found it just inside the canyon edge before the first light of morning, sitting against the rocky ground where the wind had pressed it flat. He had smelled the child before he saw the paper. A small creature, young, no threat in her at all. He had heard her footsteps at the fence line for several evenings in a row before that, always during the dust wind, always the same light, careful steps. He had not gone a look. He had just listened. That he picked up the drawing with 2 claws and held it where the early light could reach it. The image was simple. A small figure, 2 arms out, one hand raised in a gesture he did not recognize as language, but understood immediately as intention. The figure had a round face with 2 dots for eyes and a curved line for a mouth that went upward at the corners. Underneath, it were symbols he could not read. He looked at them for a long time anyway. It was a self-portrait. The creature had drawn herself. She had sent him her own face. He turned the paper carefully. He looked at both sides. Then he did something he had not done in a very long time. He carried the object somewhere specific, not just anywhere in the cave, to the back wall, where the Vreth relics sat in the dark. Old pottery, worn carvings, the things he had not been able to leave behind, even when everything else was gone. He set the drawing there, against the wall, next to a small clay marker that had once belonged to Veth. Then he went back to the canyon entrance and exhaled slowly into the morning air. She came back the next day. He heard her at the fence again, the same light steps, a small pause, and then the sound of paper being pressed through the gap in the wire. He waited until she left. Then he went and retrieved it. This drawing was of him. It was not accurate in any technical sense. She had given him enormous wings, wider than the canyon, and eyes that were round and bright and took up most of his face. She had colored his scales in dark blue and purple, colors he did not have, but which she had apparently decided suited him. He looked, in her drawing, like something out of an old story told to children to make the dark seem less frightening and more wonderful. Underneath the image, she had written something again. He could not read it, but she had pressed hard with the crayon on certain parts, the way someone does when they want to make sure the words carry weight. He held the drawing for a long time. On the 3rd day, she brought another. Herself and him, side by side, her figure very small next to his. On the 4th day, a drawing of the planet from above, with a large circle around the canyon and a smaller circle around the colony and a line connecting them. On the 5th day, she did not bring a drawing at all. She just stood at the fence for a while, and then she sat down in the dirt on her side of it and looked at the canyon that he had been watching by then. From the upper shadow of the ridge, low and still, he could see the top of her head and her small dusty boots and her hands resting open in her lap. She was not trying to see him. She was just sitting near him. There was a difference. He knew what it felt like when something was waiting to run. This was not that. This was something he had no recent name for, but recognized from a long time ago, from before the losses piled up into silence. She simply wanted to be in the same place. He thought about this for the rest of the day. He thought about the drawings on the cave wall. He thought about the self-portrait, the round face, the raised hand. Then he went down to the canyon floor and found a smooth, dark stone, one with no sharp edges, one that fit in a single small palm easily. He carried it to the fence line in the late evening when the dust wind came and the child was gone. He placed it exactly where her boots had pressed into the earth. Then he went back into the dark and waited to see what she would do with it. The stone sat on Nora's desk for 2 days before she stopped picking it up and putting it back down. It was a good stone. Heavy for its size, smooth all the way around, dark gray with a faint streak of something lighter running through the middle like a vein. She had found it sitting exactly where she always stood at the fence, placed with the kind of neatness that did not happen by accident. She had looked at it, then looked at the canyon, then put it carefully in both hands and carried it back to the settlement like it was made of something fragile. She drew a picture of herself holding the stone, smiling as wide as the crayon could make her smile, and left it at the fence that afternoon. The next morning, there was a small piece of pottery at the fence line. Old, the color of dry bone, with a thin carved line along one edge that repeated 3 times before the fragment broke off. It did not look like trash. It looked like something that had been kept somewhere carefully and then chosen for a reason. Nora brought it home and set it next to the stone. Then the dried flower came. A single stem, the bloom long gone but the shape still holding, the petals pressed into a pale brown disc. She did not know what kind of flower it was. She asked her mother to doctor. Sable Wade had been 3 days deep into a water table survey when Nora brought the flower to her workstation and held it out. Sable looked up with the distracted expression she always wore when interrupted mid-data, started to say something vague and reassuring, and then stopped. She put down her stylus. She took the flower very carefully from Nora's hand and held it under the desk light. Then she said, quietly, that she needed Nora to show her where this came from. Not in an alarmed way. In the voice she used when something surprised her so thoroughly that she had to be very still about it. Nora showed her the collection. The stone, the pottery fragment, the flower, and the growing stack of drawings she had left, and the fact that every single one of them had disappeared from the other side of the fence by morning. Sable sat on the edge of Nora's bunk and looked at the objects for a long time without speaking. The flower species had been listed as extinct on Drayan, 7 for over 150 years. The pottery fragment matched the style of Vreth mourning ceremony vessels from the pre-collapse period. Not decorative pieces, not common household items. Objects placed deliberately for the dead or for the deeply honored. She had been chosen deliberately. A child had been chosen deliberately. Sable did not tell Nora to stop. She asked if she could come to the fence the next morning just to watch and stay back so she would not interrupt anything. Nora thought about this seriously and then said yes. As long as her mother did not talk, Sable agreed. She also quietly pulled every academic file she had access to on Vreth symbolic communication and read through the night. That was the same evening Counselor Dren arrived at Station Redfield. He came with 2 assistants and a lot of quiet efficiency. He was not unkind. He shook hands with the settlement director and thanked the staff for their cooperation and used words like streamlined and accelerated timeline without ever raising his voice. He was there to conduct the reclassification survey for the Ridge. The mining consortium had been waiting 3 years. If the survey found no evidence of communicative intelligence, the protected zone status would be lifted and the Ridge would be open for extraction within 6 months. The survey data on file was 3 years old. It showed Subject V. 1 is stationary, non-communicative, and non-responsive to all standard contact protocols. Sable heard the briefing from the back of the room with Nora asleep on her shoulder and said nothing. She was thinking about the morning pottery. She was thinking about the extinct flower. She was thinking about a creature that had been alone for 3 centuries, answering a child's drawings with objects chosen from the most sacred part of what had left. She was not going to say anything yet. Not until she understood what she had. Nora did not know about Counselor Dren or the mining consortium or the word reclassification. She went to sleep that night thinking about what to draw next. She had been working on something big, something that would take a full sheet of paper and all the colors she had. She wanted to draw everything: the canyon, the colony, the red plains, the violet sky, all of it together, with Dracker in the middle and the humans nearby, and nothing separated by a fence. She wanted to show him that there was room, that the world was big enough for all of it at once, if everyone just agreed to stay. She finished the drawing just before dawn, pressed the last crayon stroke flat, and looked at what she had made. It took up the whole page. At the bottom, in the largest letters she had ever written, she put the only words she knew that were big enough. She wrote, "Please do not go away." She folded it with great care and walked to the fence in the pale early light before anyone else was awake, and she pushed it through. Then she sat down in the dirt and waited to see if the canyon breathed back. The perimeter alarm went off at dawn on a Tuesday, not the emergency tone. The proximity alert, the low, steady pulse that meant something large had come within 200 meters of the settlement's outer wall. It had never gone off before. In 3 years on Drayan 7, nothing from the wild had ever come that close to Station Redfield on purpose. The duty officer checked the sensor grid and went pale. Subject V1 was at the main gate, not charging, not circling, standing, facing the gate directly, still as a boulder, with the first pale light of morning coming up behind the canyon ridge and making his outline look carved from the world itself. He was bigger than the photographs. The photographs had not captured the weight of him, the way he seemed to press against the air around him just by being present. His wings were folded flat against his back, and his head was low, and he was holding something in his front claws. The settlement woke up fast and badly. People came into the main corridor in various states of undress and alarm. The settlement director called Counselor Dren. Dren's assistant called the Defensive Protocol Unit. Someone suggested the high-frequency deterrent system, and 2 people agreed loudly. Aaron, who was 16 and had grown up hearing that the thing beyond the fence was the one rule you did not break, went to find Nora because he had a feeling she already knew something. He was right. She was already dressed, standing at the corridor window that faced the gate, watching. He grabbed her arm and told her to get away from the window. She shook her head and pointed. Aaron looked. Dracker had set something down in front of the gate. A stack of papers, held together carefully, set on the ground with the same deliberate neatness as the stone at the fence. Even from a distance, even through scratched corridor glass, Aaron could see what they were: drawings. Crayon drawings. Every single one that Nora had pushed through the fence over the past several weeks, stacked in order, the oldest at the bottom and the most recent on top. The big one, the everything drawing, sat right on top of the pile with "Please do not go away" visible in large block letters. He had kept all of them. He had brought all of them here. Nora was already moving toward the gate door. Aaron caught her and said, "Absolutely not." And she looked at him with a particular expression she had that made adults feel like they were the ones being unreasonable. He did not let go. She did not fight him. She just turned back to the window and waited. Sable Wade came through the corridor at a near run, saw Nora safe, and exhaled. Then she went to the gate observation panel and looked out for a long time. Dracker had not moved. He was simply standing there, his massive scaled head turned slightly toward the gate, patient in a way that only something very old could be patient. Sable knew what the wing posture meant. She had read it in the Vreth cultural files at 3 in the morning 2 nights ago. Wings folded and flat with the leading edge angled down was a formal acknowledgement gesture. It was used, according to the oldest survey records, when a Vreth elder was presenting themselves to someone they recognized as significant, that he was not threatening. He was introducing himself. Counselor Dren arrived in the corridor with his assistant and took one look at the sensor readout and started talking about the deterrent system again. Sable stepped in front of him and said his name once, clearly, and held up her hand. She told him everything. The drawings, the objects, the pottery fragment and what it meant, the flower species that had been extinct for 150 years. She told him that this creature had been receiving and responding to symbolic communication for over 3 weeks, and that every single exchange had been deliberate, chosen, and contextually appropriate in ways that matched Vreth cultural records precisely. She told him that the creature standing at their gate had just carried a month's worth of a child's crayon drawings across 3 kilometers of open ground to present them at the door of the settlement, using a formal acknowledgement posture that had not been observed in any living Vreth individual since before the colony was built. Dren listened to all of it. Then he said the GSE protocol required a verifiable mutual exchange of intentional symbolic meaning, documented and witnessed. What she had, he said, was observational data and interpretation. He was not dismissing it, but he needed something provable, not inferred. He gave her 48 hours to produce it. Sable nodded once and went back to the window. Outside, Dracker had not moved. The drawing sat in front of the gate in the early morning light, the top page lifting very slightly at one corner in the wind and then settling again. Aaron stood beside Sable and looked out at the creature that had terrified him since childhood, standing quiet and still with a stack of a little girl's crayon pictures at his feet. He said, slowly, that he would help. Whatever she needed, he would help. Sable said she appreciated that. Then she looked at Nora, who was still at the window with both hands pressed flat against the glass, and she understood that the help she actually needed was not going to come from either of them. That IT was going to come from the one person in the settlement who had never needed 48 hours to understand what was happening out there. Sable worked through the night with every file she had. Erin sat at the second desk in her workroom and sorted documents without being asked, putting the cultural records in one stack and the sensor logs in another and the photographic evidence in a third. He did not say much. He had not said much since standing at the corridor window that morning and watching a creature he had always been told was simply a large, silent, dangerous thing standing at the gate, holding a child's drawings like they were made of glass. He kept thinking about that, about the care of it. The documentation Sable built through the night was thorough. Timestamped sensor logs showing Dracker's movements toward the fence on the evenings after each drawing was left. Photographs of the objects he had sent in return. A full analysis of the pottery fragment, confirming its origin and ceremonial significance. Records from 3 separate xenobiological databases confirming the flower species as extinct. A map of the object placements showing consistent, deliberate positioning relative to where Nora always stood at IT was a strong case. Sable knew it was strong. She also knew that under GSE Protocol 19, strong was not enough. The standard required a documented exchange where both parties used symbols with verifiable shared meaning, witnessed in real time. Everything she had was evidence of communication that had already happened. What Dren needed was communication he could watch occur. She did not know how to make that happen in 48 hours with a creature that had not spoken a word in over 3 centuries and had spent the last several weeks communicating through a fence using children's drawings and ancient pottery. Nora solved it the next morning by doing what she always did. She got up early, took a blank piece of paper from her desk, and picked up a crayon. Sable found her at the kitchen table and started to explain the situation, the 48 hours, the protocol requirement, the need for a witnessed exchange. Nora listened carefully and then asked one question. She asked if she was allowed to go to the gate. Sable thought about it for longer than she expected to. Then she said yes. Dracker was still there. He had spent the night in the same position, patient and still, which had unnerved the night watch considerably, but had not changed anything. The drawings were still on the ground in front of the gate, slightly damp now from the early morning air. Sable set up a recording unit near the gate observation panel. Aaron stood beside her. Counselor Dren was there too, arms folded, expression careful and unreadable. Nora went to the gate window and looked out. Dracker's head turned toward the window slowly, the way a very large thing moves when it does not want to startle a small one. Nora pressed her hand flat against the glass. She held up the blank paper. Then she picked up her crayon and drew on it while Dracker watched. She drew a stone, a smooth, simple oval, shaded dark, the way the stone had looked when she first found it at the fence. She held the drawing up against the glass and pointed at it. Then she pointed at the ground just outside the gate, at the spot in the dirt closest to the fence where the first stone had been placed. She tapped the drawing. She pointed at the ground. She tapped the drawing again. She was asking him to confirm it. This object, that place, The canyon beyond had been red and silent and enormous for 3 years without giving anything back. Every adult in the room behind Nora had spent those 3 years learning not to expect anything from it. Dracker looked at the drawing through the glass. He looked at Nora. Then he lowered his head very slowly until his face was level with the observation window, close enough that the glass fogged slightly at the edge from the heat of him, and he extended one claw tip toward the gate and drew a single deliberate line in the dirt. Then he drew it again, parallel to the first, and then a third one. The same mark, the same spacing. Sable made a sound that was not quite words. The line was the symbol from the bottom edge of the morning pottery fragment, repeated 3 times, which in Vreth ceremonial language indicated confirmation of recognized meaning. She had read that in the cultural files at 4 in the morning and had not been sure she had understood it correctly until this moment. He had not just answered. He had answered in the correct formal register. He knew what the pottery meant. He had chosen it on purpose, and now he was confirming that the choice had been intentional. Aaron said, quietly, that this had to count. His voice had gone a little rough. He said that a 7-year-old figured out how to have a conversation with the last elder of an entire civilization using a box of crayons and the patience to show up every single day and try. And if the GSC could look at what just happened on that recording and call it unverifiable, then the protocol was broken and not the evidence. Dren had not moved. He watched the recording panel replay the last 90 seconds. Then he watched it again. And again, he did not speak for a long time. Outside, Nora had pressed both palms flat against the glass and was looking up at Dracker's enormous face from about half a meter away with a completely unafraid expression that had apparently been her natural state from birth. Dracker held still. The fog from his breath spread slowly across the lower edge of the glass. Dren said, finally, that he was suspending the reclassification. He said a formal communication study would be ordered under the full protection provisions of the GSC Charter. He said this was the correct determination given the evidence. He said it like a man reading a report. But he watched the window for another minute after, where a small human child and the last of an ancient species were fogging up the glass between them, before he turned and walked away down the corridor. 6 months after the gate morning, xenobiologists from 4 different research institutions were using the phrase Redfield exchange in their papers. That IT had become a kind of shorthand for the whole story. A 7-year-old child, a box of crayons, and a creature that had been silent for 3 centuries. The formal communication study was ongoing. Sable Wade was its lead researcher, working with a team that had grown from 2 people to 11, all of them carefully building a shared symbolic vocabulary between human language and what remained of written Vreth. It was slow work. It was the best work any of them had ever done. Dracker had moved out of the canyon, not far. He had settled on the open ground between the ridge and the settlement fence, a wide flat space that belonged to neither place and therefore seemed to belong to both. He slept there some nights, his wings half spread to catch the warmth that came off the red plains after sunset. The colony had stopped setting the proximity alarms. There was no point. He was simply there, the way the ridge was there, the way the violet sky was there. Part of the landscape. Nora still brought drawings every morning. The tribunal arrived on a cold, clear day in what passed for autumn on Dran. 7.3 members, senior to Counselor Dran by several pay grades, and considerably less willing to be moved by anything as unquantifiable as a fogged-up window. They had reviewed all of Sable's documentation and found it compelling but incomplete. The primary issue, the lead member explained in the settlement's briefing room, was that existing GSC law defined communicative intelligence using a framework built for spoken or written language. Symbolic exchange through objects and drawings existed in a legal gray area. Without a clear legislative category, the protection could not be guaranteed long-term regardless of what the evidence showed. The Mining Consortium's application was still active. The lead member did not say this like a threat. She said it like a fact, which was somehow worse. Sable had responses prepared. The team had responses prepared. They presented for 40 minutes with everything they had, every documented exchange, every cultural cross-reference, every piece of evidence that a mind was present and communicating on the other side of that canyon. The lead member listened carefully and said she would consider her recommendation. That was when Dracker walked up to the meeting area. Nobody had told him the tribunal was there. Nobody had suggested or planned or coordinated anything. He simply appeared at the edge of the open ground outside the briefing building, as quiet as he always was, and he waited. The tribunal's lead member stepped outside because her assistant told her something was there and she wanted to see it directly. She was a practical woman who did not frighten easily, and she stood on the step and looked at the biggest living thing she had ever seen standing roughly 30 meters away, and she held very still. Dracker looked at her. Then he looked past her, and his gaze moved to Nora, who had followed the adults outside because Nora always followed the adults outside. He reached into the space just beneath one of his folded wings, a motion so careful it looked strange on something that large, and he brought out a piece of paper point one piece. Folded twice, edges worn soft, slightly faded from months of being kept somewhere dark and warm. He sat on the ground in front of him. Then he looked at the tribunal lead again, and he held still. Sable moved forward and picked up the paper. She unfolded IT. IT was the first drawing. The very first one. Nora at age 7, 2 arms out, one hand raised in a wave, round face, curved smile. I am Nora written in large block letters at the bottom. The orange and brown crayon, a little smudged now at the edges, but intact, kept intact through dust and rain and 6 months of a formal survey and 100 moments that could have ended with this world going to the consortium and this creature going to a relocation facility somewhere distant and cold. He had kept the first picture. Through all of it, he had kept it. Nora looked at the drawing in her mother's hands and then looked at Dracker, and she waved. Big and slow, the same wave she had drawn herself making all those months ago. Dracker exhaled. Long and low, directed at her, warm in the cold morning air, she waved again. The tribunal lead stood on the step and watched this for a moment. Then she asked Sable, quietly, what the exhale meant. Sable told her it was the closest thing the Vreth language had to the word cherished, that it was reserved, according to every cultural record they had, for someone you did not want to lose. The lead member was quiet for a while after that. Her 2 colleagues stood beside her and said nothing useful. She filed a recommendation that evening. Full protected status under a new legislative instrument that her office would draft and submit within 30 days. Her written reasoning ran to 6 pages of careful GSE language, and at the very end, in the last paragraph, she wrote one sentence that was later transmitted across 40-member worlds of the Galactic Survey Council. IT said, "The creature kept the picture. That is not the behavior of something that does not understand. That is the behavior of someone who does not want to forget." The formal study continued for another 2 years. The fence came down in the spring. A proper gate went up in its place, one that opened from both sides. Nora kept drawing. Dracker kept every single one that in the end, that was the whole story. A child who was not afraid to say hello. An ancient thing that had stopped expecting anyone to try. And between them, a language that nobody had to be taught because it was made entirely out of the decision to show up and mean something and keep showing up until the other one knew that you were not going to leave in a galaxy that moved fast and counted everything and filed the rest. 2 people sat on either side of an open gate in the morning light and drew pictures of each other, and it was enough. It was in fact everything.